Okay, is this working? You can hear? Excellent. So, I came across Christoph's work a few years back, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, because of a blog entry that he wrote called On the Very Idea of Western Philosophy. And in that essay, Christoph does something really interesting, which he takes a really broad-scale historical narrative about how we're taught the history of philosophy. If you ever picked up, any of the sort of big classic sort of massive scale overviews about how the whole thing works, they tend to tell the same kind of story. It's a kind of Plato to NATO progression. Philosophy begins in ancient Greece. It has amazing, glorious 1,000 years, sort of is in the doldrums for a bit in the Middle Ages before Descartes brings it all back. And we have all of this sort of series of amazing thinkers of Descartes and Kant and Hegel and Heidegger and all of the rest of it until we get to our present moment. And Christoph did a bunch of interesting things in that essay which kind of just undermine the idea that we have a single coherent tradition, but sort of without any gaps, one that sort of excludes all other kinds of intellectual inquiry from everywhere else in the world, and kind of is what it claims to be. And we were talking about this earlier, and Christoph said that he'd never quite made the connection before, so this is something that I'm very much proposing, but that Christoph basically does something quite similar in this new book, in that he takes analytic philosophy, which I'm not going to give a definition or an overview of, because part of what Christoph does is to show why it's not nearly so clear as what you might have always thought. But the form of philosophy that is pretty much completely dominant in universities, at least, in the Western, in the English-speaking world, in Germany, Scandinavia, and increasingly in other parts of the world as well. If there has ever been a form of philosophy which is globally hegemonic, it would be analytic philosophy. And I think Christoph offers all sorts of interesting ways to sort of undermine the idea that we have a single, easily definable, obvious thing that we're working with here. And so it's going to piss a lot of people off. It's already started to piss some people off. The angry and self-admittedly defensive reviews have already started coming in. But rather than sort of trying to tell you a little bit about what I take this thing to be, I'm going to start by asking Christoph the really annoying and question which is very much in the spirit of analytic philosophy of, well, what do you mean by analytic philosophy?
Well, thank you for starting me off on that foot. So, as you were already saying, something that's really apparent about analytic philosophy to anyone who has sort of gone down the route of becoming interested in philosophy and then getting into the academic study of it, and finding that if you do this in the United Kingdom or the United States or other parts of the English-speaking world or in Scandinavia, that you get presented a picture of philosophy that not only is a very specific picture of philosophy, but that sort of doesn't advertise itself as that. So there's a kind of way in which the analytic way of doing philosophy has become so naturalized. That is, it just seems like the way that philosophy is done. And this is often how philosophy lecturers teach philosophy to their students, is they just tell them, well, there is this big set of problems. There are metaphysical problems, there are ethical problems, epistemological problems, and so on. And they get very neatly laid out for you. But there's no real questioning of why we're saying first of all, that these specifically are the problems and that they're to be tackled in the way that they're actually treated by analytic philosophers. So there's this sort of sense of naturalness. But there is, of course, such a thing as what analytic philosophy is. Now, like any kind of relatively complex cultural and social phenomenon, it actually eludes definition because it takes all sorts of different forms. But I have thought about what the best ways might be to give people a sense of how one might characterize it. So, I mean, the easy thing to say is, well, you kind of recognize it when you see it. But what is it that you recognize? Well, one of the ways to think about this, I think, is to think in terms of a particular kind of mindset or kind of intellectual orientation that analytic philosophy shares with two big sort of ideological entities that have been around for a long time and that are the dominant ideological entities in Western Europe, which are empiricism and liberalism. And empiricism and liberalism have it in common that they think of what it is to be a subject or an inquiring agent, and also just an agent, somebody who acts in the world, in a very particular kind of way that is itself naturalized. So something that we are encouraged to accept as just being the way that things are, even though it's a very specific conception. And that conception is something like, well, each of us is a subject, and this is a kind of extensionless point, completely neutral in character, so that you and I and all the other subjects are in some sense completely interchangeable with one another. That is, they don't have any particular, what people outside the analytic tradition would call subjectivity about them. And these subjects are faced with a world which is thought of in a very specific way, namely the world is composed of a whole set of discrete atomic items that are put together in a certain way. And the subject has to somehow negotiate this world, take it in, act in relation to it, and so on, where the process of understanding it and the process of then coming to act in the appropriate way in response to this understanding takes the form of sort of taking in all the little bits and putting them together. And then, as necessary, decomposing the world again into all its little component parts. And the reason I use this expression, all the little bits, is it's actually almost a direct quotation from the introduction to a series of papers by one of the most important and prominent analytic philosophers, David Lewis, who was an American philosopher working in the 1970s and 1980s, who describes the world as consisting of what he calls a Humean mosaic. And he describes it as consisting of all individual, discrete little things. He says one thing after another. Right? And this is what the world is like. And so if you think that that's what the world is like, and the subject is this sort of extensionless point that's trying to interact with this, you're then likely, or you quickly end up with a conception of philosophy which is analytic in the sense of thinking that the thing to do is to break the world apart into its component parts, do this very carefully, very assiduously, and then put things back together again. And this notion of, so the kind of atomism that I'm describing, the idea that the world is fundamentally composed of individual little bits, and that the great sort of totality of the world is the aggregate of those little bits, is reflected also in the way in which analytic philosophers tend to think about human beings or human subjects, which is that collectivities of us, communities, groups of us, are to be understood in the first instance as aggregates of individuals, each with their own little projects, or each with their own minds. And any kind of collective understanding has to build up from there, right? As opposed to a way of thinking of collectivities or groups as in themselves organisms of a certain kind, or entities in their own right that can then be thought of as breakable down, but not losslessly, right? So something goes wrong if you merely try to sort of slice them up into little bits. So, I mean, that should already, I think, give some idea of both what the mindset is and also why analytic philosophy, when you come into contact with it, looks a certain way, namely that there are these, there's a familiar set of problems which are treated as if they're kind of stable problems that can't themselves be sort of reformulated or recast. So what you end up with is a sort of set menu of schematic, quite abstract problems and arguments, which are then tackled by the construction of very schematic, stepwise arguments. Right? So analytic philosophers love to put things into premise and conclusion form, and if you don't have, the premise is laid out discretely, and then an inference made to a conclusion, it's thought that you've somehow already gone wrong philosophically, by contrast with the conception of philosophy, where philosophy is something like the expansion of the imagination. Right? So that's something I think that can't happen. Instead, what you get is something analytic philosophers say a lot about what they do, which is account giving. So if there's a definition of analytic philosophy, I think it should be something like it's the giving of accounts. And analytic philosophers are account givers. And it's important that they use this word account because it's not, an account is not a theory. Whereas if you say that you offer a theory of something, a theory is, in offering a theory, you're called upon to give some kind of story about what it would be for your theory to have explanatory value. Right? To what body of knowledge your theory is a contribution. Whereas you can give an account without committing yourself in any way as to what the account, what constitutes the success of the account. The account is just the answer to a certain kind of question, which takes the form, what is X? So a lot of analytic philosophy consists of accounts of what certain things are. And this is curious because answering the question what something is tends to be actually extremely difficult, if not impossible. But so, yeah, account giving of a certain kind that follows, I think, this very schematic conception of what inquiry is and what an argument is.
Well, thank you for giving us that account. And I guess you sort of you alight on a couple of really key things about what analytic philosophy is, and I guess why to a lot of people it can feel quite profoundly unsatisfying. So one of the things is, I guess, you're giving an account as opposed to proposing a sort of huge theory, right? So back in the day, philosophers used to say everything is water, or a theory of the forms, or, the noumena and the phenomena or something, these massive global accounts of reality. And some people feel like, and maybe this is more to do with professionalization of the discipline than anything else, but they were increasingly sort of going into little, small technical arguments on particular points. And the second point was about this sort of atomization, right? So, human individual here looking out onto the world of which they're kind of implicitly, maybe they're apart from this extra thing called agency that we'll add on. But basically there's the world and here are the individuals and a couple of other individuals added together, and you've got a community, which is this additional thing. That's not the point of departure for where we start. And you mention in the book that there are important connections here between neoclassical economics and the idea of sort of, homo economicus and stuff, and also with sort of behaviorism in psychology. But it's the third one of those that I kind of wanted to ask about, which is the idea that it can be somewhat kind of ahistoric, something which is, looking at these problems, atemporal problems that have always been there, right? We're interested in being the same problem that Plato or Kant or whoever else was interested in general, detached from any kind of history. And I guess what you're doing is trying to say that the ideas, in the case of analytic philosophy, and these are not quite so free-floating, atemporal, from individual atomic subjects, but that these came from individuals in communities at a particular place and time. So I guess what I want to ask is, we've got an account of what analytic philosophy is, but why do we need a social history of it?
Yeah, so I think precisely because of this claim to ahistoricity, right? As soon as somebody says, I'm not situated anywhere in time, I'm not situated anywhere culturally or politically, I'm just speaking, from... there used to be a thing called the view from nowhere, right? That immediately raises the question, well, what sort of a person in what cultural conditions would say such a thing, right? And part of the reason why I wanted to write the book and why I got sort of increasingly interested in the topic as I got into it was, as you would expect, I guess, but you find that it's a very interesting set of specific historical conditions in which this becomes a desirable thing to say. So, for example, the specific conditions of Vienna, which is one of the places where one of the kind of main tributaries of analytic philosophy is born, in the era of Viennese modernism, in which it became possible for people to claim that they were effecting a radical break with the past that was so radical that it wasn't just a break with the past, but it was a break with the very idea of having a past at all. And what you see, so if you read the manifesto of the Vienna Circle, actually what you get is the invocation of a whole set of ancestor figures. And those ancestor figures are people either from the 18th century liberal tradition, so people like David Hume, or sort of intermediaries from 19th century British and Austrian liberalism. And that then, I think, isn't surprising in that what you see analytic philosophy ultimately do is it reconnects itself to an 18th century tradition, an 18th century set of preoccupations. It's just that now it's become very desirable to say, we're not a tradition. We're not continuing the tradition of the 18th century Enlightenment, essentially. We've entitled ourselves to say we're not a tradition at all. So it's a very powerful way to continue a tradition, to say that you aren't one.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously they're writing in a Vienna, which is the capital, not of a sort of huge, massive empire anymore like it was before the war, but in a small, tiny little rump state where basically you have hardcore, fascists basically in Black Vienna, and then the communists and socialists in left Vienna at the same time, who are sort of squabbling on either sides. And they're a part of that, right? So, I mean, one way that you could take your argument in the book, if you were being defensive, would be to say that Christoph's trying to just show how all analytic philosophy is somehow kind of, reactionary and tied to a kind of, liberal, empiricist point of view on things. But look, here are these guys in Vienna, and, they were all lefties, weren't they? They were all, interested in building all of this social housing and bringing ideas out to the masses. So I just wonder if there's a sort of, you've got an idea about what exactly is the connection you're suggesting between this kind of view that you're talking about of detached value neutrality and all the rest of it, and on the other hand.
Yeah, so there are, I think, lots of different ways to read the story of the Vienna Circle and the rise of logical positivism, which is their way of doing philosophy. Precisely because there is this left-wing element in the Vienna Circle. So it's by no means that the whole circle is left-wing. And in fact, the man who's at the center of it and who founds the circle, Moritz Schlick, who'd been a physicist, and really was a physicist, he did his PhD under Max Planck, was a kind of centrist figure in the circle who was there to hold the whole thing together. So there were the people that were actively engaged in politics, and then there were the people that, as the phrase went, were allowed to stay on the icy slopes of logic. And it was important that all these people could be kept happy, and Moritz Schlick did this. But there's this left-wing element to the circle that emerges. I think its emergence has to be understood really in terms of the internal politics of, as you put it, this sort of rump that remains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? Largely German-speaking, very small state called Austria that has Vienna as its capital. Namely, that there's the rise of these very vociferous, what would now be called populist, irrationalist movements, of which fascism is one. And in this context, the social democrats, who at this point are still very close to being Marxists, it's very close to being a Marxist party, form an alliance effectively with the liberals in order to act as a kind of joint bulwark against these populist movements. So the idea is that whereas the populist movements are trying to sort of sweep up people's affects, and stir them up into these populist movements, there's an alternative, which is to appeal to people's reason, right? to capture them, to capture their minds, to capture their rational minds. And both the liberals and the social democrats are in their business of doing that. So for them, so people like Otto Neurath, who had actually been active in the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which is a short-lived communist government in Bavaria in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Otto Neurath, Rudolf Carnap, and a mathematician called Hans Hahn they're the three kind of key figures on the left. And they're the authors of the manifesto of the Vienna Circle. They, for them, right, the project of what they call the unity of science, which is this extremely hardcore empiricist project, according to which the only kind of worthwhile inquiry that there can be into the world is empirical inquiry, and the standards for this are very, very strenuous standards. So religion, metaphysics, all of these things can be swept aside because they will turn out to be nonsense by these standards and so on. This program they call Unified Science, and they see it as almost directly connected with a program of universal housing, universal education, the socialization of just about every part of the economy. And so there is this sort of vociferously left-wing version of what the Vienna Circle is up to. Now, so one way to take this is to say, well, there is a kind of left-wing element to analytic philosophy. But the thing that's interesting about that is that immediately after the Second World War, so the Vienna Circle is more or less, it's a mixture kind of crushed and disbanded in the 30s as Nazis come to power in Austria. And many of the members have to flee. So one reason that they flee is that they're Jewish. Another reason that they flee is that they are politically, their position becomes politically untenable. And they end up fleeing to the United States, or moving to the United States in some cases. And what you see when they're in the United States is that their the political edge to their program completely drops away. So now there are different ways to take that, because one thing you could think is that it's the conditions that they face in America, namely the conditions of McCarthyism, are so harsh that the genuine deep redness of these people sort of just gets blanched out of them completely by that. Or you could think slightly less favorably to the left Vienna Circle members, that they're having their redness sort of washed out of them so easily suggests that there was something much less deep about it. But either way, I mean, in terms of the development of analytic philosophy and what analytic philosophy turns out to be, it turns out that this left-wing component is actually not essential to it, right? It subsides.
I'm interested that you've already started to take us on one of the most important legs of the journey of what comes to be called analytic philosophy, right? So the way that you have the story here is that you've got the supposed origin point of analytic philosophy is in Cambridge, the sort of turn of the century. We've got Russell and Moore doing something that they call analysis, sort of breaking down. Then we've got, via the sort of figure of Wittgenstein, people doing other interesting things in Vienna, which kind of connects up the two of those tangentially. But really, you suggest these are disparate, quite different, along with the Polish logicians and some other interesting things on the continent, quite diffuse kind of traditions, right? Until, Moritz Schlick gets shot by a crazed fascist student. They all have to flee over to America, and it's in America that something solidifies these various trends within American universities, and with some proximity to parts of the American state that I invite you to talk about a little bit more. This program that is now called analytic philosophy, and that it's only from that point on that we get this very hegemonic form of philosophy, completely coincidentally, I'm sure, the point that America emerges as the global hegemon. So could you tell us a bit about this point where all these different sort of things are alloyed together into something that we call analytic philosophy?
Yeah, so we haven't really spoken yet about Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore or Wittgenstein, who I suppose are the kind of first people that spring to mind when people think of the history of analytic philosophy. Yeah, and also curiously, this only became apparent to me, speaking about, like trying to kind of explain what the book is about. It's curious that it's really only the people from before the Second World War that are any kind of recognizable names. I mean, in some cases, household names. Like Russell's really a household name, but Of course, none of the important analytic philosophers from after the Second World War are really known to anyone unless they've, sat through philosophy classes. And that's a kind of remarkable thing. But that's curious for me, it's curious because a sort of central thesis of the book is that analytic philosophy as such, as we recognize it, only really gets going after the Second World War. So as Jonathan said, as I see things, before the Second World War, there's a set of really disparate movements, and disparate because they have different methodologies and they have different conceptions of philosophy, and they really care about these different conceptions of philosophy. So something that happens after the war is that what you think philosophy actually is, or what it's for, or how you do it, comes to seem much less important. So as analytic philosophy gets solidified, it sort of loses this methodological self-consciousness. But so there's Russell and Moore, who are both in Cambridge, and they perform what Russell liked to call the rebellion against idealism, which is a thing they did in 1898. And it was really in this year that they decided to go with this new kind of philosophy. Very quickly, though, the two of them even split from each other, because Russell has this extremely ambitious conception of philosophy. Often he calls it scientific philosophy, where the idea is like philosophy is to become like science. And it's going to do this big program of understanding matter and understanding mind, and it's going to do physics and psychology and join all of this together in some kind of great philosophical apotheosis. And he really thought this. Moore, on the other hand, was all about retreating to common sense. Let's not worry about he always talked about philosophers in the third person. Philosophers have worried about this and that, but aren't we all just in a room, with books and tables and chairs and hands and all of this, and let's just settle back into that. The Vienna people we already talked about a bit. They have again a very different program in which it's all a question of really, really respecting the natural sciences and understanding properly what the natural sciences can tell us, but the natural sciences treated on their own terms. So there are all these different things going on, and it's only after the war, the Second World War, that people actually even start to speak of analytic philosophy. And so to people who are, really, really invested and deep on the inside of it, this will matter a lot, and to people who are just interested in it because it's one of the ways that people have done philosophy, and it's the hegemonic way, and let's be interesting to understand why it's hegemonic, it'll seem much less interesting or important. But to the kind of usual analytic philosopher who isn't a scholar, it seems like analytic philosophy just always existed. As soon as Russell and Moore came on the scene, or even before that, Gottlob Frege in Germany as a mathematician, and there's this continuous tradition. Isn't really a tradition, but there's a continuous lineup of these important people, and it just really isn't like that, right? It's in post-war conditions in America that one of the emigres from the Vienna Circle, a man called Herbert Feigl, got together with an American philosopher called Wilfrid Sellars, and basically came up with the idea of analytic philosophy, and they published this big anthology of what they thought were classic papers in philosophy, which were the things that all philosophy students should be made to read. And it was called Readings in Philosophical Analysis. And they say explicitly in the preface to this book, there are all these different things people have been doing in philosophy. We consider them all to be part of the right way. And they are logical positivism, Russell, Moore, the work of Polish logicians, which is also very important in this, and then certain American philosophers, some of the American pragmatists. So one of the things actually that I hadn't really realized about American philosophy is just how diverse American philosophy was, even still in the 1950s. People were doing all sorts of things, right? So there was very ambitious, speculative metaphysics, and in that camp there were realists and there were idealists, and then there were the pragmatists, and there were people studying contemporary Indian philosophy in quite a serious way. There's all sorts of things going on in the American Academy. And philosophy also was, I say in the academy, but philosophy in America was something that was done widely outside the universities as well. And that's something that starts to completely shrink after the Second World War. And you get this professionalization. And now it's, well, we ought to do analysis. And this is a kind of amalgamation of what the Vienna people might have understood by this and what Moore and Russell might have understood by it. But in any case, it's an analysis, and it now had this shared literature of the people that, you know, one should read and refer to, which, you know, explicitly did not include Heidegger or, you know, people of that sort. And so you get this sort of solidification of this idea, and its promotion, right? It's becoming the sort of leading mode is very much, I think, facilitated by the kind of places in which these analytic philosophers work. So the key one is the Rand Corporation, Research and Development, which came out of military research during the Second World War. So after the Second World War, military research in the United States turned to a new purpose, which is the conduct of what became known as the Cold War. Because America, emerging sort of uniquely victorious from the war, with as its only real rival its former ally, the Soviet Union, it now developed this complex about itself that it was going to be attacked by the Soviet Union. And all its energy, this is an exaggeration, many of its energies, in terms of research funding anyway, went into figuring out how to get there first before the Soviets nuked the United States and so on. And a whole sort of pantheon of analytic philosophers worked in this place. So Hans Reichenbach, who'd come from Berlin, was part of the Berlin Circle, which is the Berlin version of the Vienna Circle. Alfred Tarski, who's the most important of the Polish logic people. W.V. Quine, Donald Davidson. All of these people worked at Rand, and their minds were captured by a whole new set of techniques, which were those of rational choice theory, decision theory, and game theory, right? Which are different versions, sort of different permutations of an approach in economics, all of which have it in common that we think of human beings as maximally rational, individualistic agents trying to outwit each other. And you get very interesting results if you then think about how these agents would respond to each other or how they would act in groups and so on. But it really surprised me, actually, the extent to which analytic philosophers were embedded within Rand for quite a while during the 50s.
So I want to ask about one of those people. I'm not sure if he worked at Rand, but was certainly someone that was interested in the game theory and decision theory world that's developing at that time. But first, I wanted to come back to this point about, we have this amalgam of an incredibly rich and diverse array of, Polish logic and Cambridge analysis and the Vienna Circle and all the rest of it. And yet it seems that by the time analytic philosophy does emerge fully formed, it has become something that's not incredibly rich and diverse, or at least not as wide-ranging as we might have expected philosophy to be, or as much as that other thing that's not analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, right? The thing that they do on the continent, except not, the Vienna Circle or Wittgenstein or Tarski or all of those ones that actually are from the continent, of course. They're not interested, for example, in ethics particularly. They're not interested in politics especially, or literature, or all of these other things that we might have thought philosophers would do, and these other people are doing. That is until we get to John Rawls, right? Who in analytic philosophy circles is seen as the man who resurrects political philosophy, right? Everyone had just stopped doing it at some point, after Kant or maybe Hegel or something like that, or maybe Sidgwick was doing something in ethics, but basically no one does political philosophy on this story until Rawls comes along with the decision theory and stuff that he's interested in and founds analytic political philosophy. Entirely forgetting, of course, that you have the entire early period of decolonization with a whole host of very interesting thinkers, all of the feminist thinkers of the point, and of course the Marxist tradition, which, existed at the time. So how do we get to a point, number one, in which philosophy of this sort has overlooked all of these things that we might have thought were central to a discipline that professes to be the love of wisdom? And secondly, like, what was so important about Rawls when he did come along?
Well, there's something honest, about the pushing out of ethics. Because, people in the Vienna Circle, these were people with real intellectual rigor, and they tended to take the view about ethics that, well, either ethics is just people talking nonsense to each other, expressing, mere emotion, which couldn't possibly have any kind of value. Or it was that, well, there had to be some kind of what was called naturalism about ethics, where really all that you could do in ethics was just study what, a certain kind of organism is bound to do under certain circumstances and consider good. And the question of what really is good has to be is one that has to be relinquished, right, in favor of the question, what sort of things do these organisms go for, and what keeps them alive, and how do they figure it out amongst themselves? And Schlick took this kind of naturalistic view, and then most of the others thought, well, so A.J. Ayer in England, who was the guy who went to Vienna and found out about all of this and told the world in his little book, Language, Truth and Logic, A.J. Ayer took the view that, ethics was nonsense, because it's just people making noises at each other, saying, boo. Yeah, boo to murder. And so,
hurrah to charity.
Yeah. The boo hurrah theory, in fact, yeah. And so it then became very difficult for anyone to engage in, ethical theory. Because if it was either nonsense or this sort of disguised biology, there wasn't much to be done. And in response to that, there's a whole phase in which philosophers in this sort of hegemonic realm, certainly in the English-speaking world, just did what they called meta-ethics, which is a really remarkable thing, right? So the idea of meta-ethics is, well, you can't do any so-called first-order ethics. You can't actually figure out what would be a good way to live or for how people should treat each other. So instead, you just talk about what moral discourse itself is. So you step back from it, and you instead analyze moral language or something like that, which turned out to be, I think, a kind of completely arid dead end. But although, with apologies to people who do meta-ethics today, I think it continues to be an arid dead end. So there was this whole period in which ethics couldn't be done, and political philosophy also sort of lay fallow because, well, you could be a Marxist, but that was obviously completely beyond the pale. So, there was kind of nothing to be done there. And then along comes John Rawls, who'd been working at this for a long time. Right? So he begins in the 50s working on game theory. So his idea is, well, we could treat society like a game in which the people are players. And it turns out that if people play this game, what they'll want is they'll want to be treated in certain ways themselves. And in light of that, what you'll get is what people will want is fairness. And then the point is to theorize what this fairness looks like. And finally, then in 1971, after 2 decades of work on this, Rawls produces this work, A Theory of Justice. And it bears emphasizing, just while we're talking about Rawls, that if you talk to anybody, and I really mean anybody in a philosophy department, if they're doing political philosophy, and also many political theory departments in the English-speaking world, if they're even so much as doing that, they will be talking about John Rawls, right? So many of them are Rawlsians. In fact, probably the majority are Rawlsians. And to be a Rawlsian is to be a kind of classical liberal who's added in game theory as a sort of tool for defending classical liberalism. Or there are people who criticize the work of John Rawls, but talk about Rawls on just about every page of their work. It's like, this is the scripture that must be engaged with. So I actually ended up talking not that much about rules, partly because there's so much to say about this phenomenon of the promotion, the explicit promotion of liberalism as as a consciously avowed ideology in philosophy departments, and how it's just sort of impossible to get around it, because this is what people are talking about. And so every conversation that happens in this sort of sphere is forced into that format. Like, if you disagree with rules, and it's, what's your problem with rules? It's not what's to be said in favor of this non-Rawlsian view just on its own terms.
So it's still around, but I guess it's been sort of somewhat updated, especially in the last 10 years or so, in what I will call analytic philosophy's woke turn, right? So analytic philosophy is now much more concerned, not just in the sort of separated off areas of ethics or political philosophy, but in some of the kind of core areas, maybe in terms of philosophy of language and stuff like that, in terms of having something to say about issues of race, gender, related topics of social importance. It seems to have sort of, I'm not sure exactly when it comes from, but you started to get a lot more of it around sort of Trump's first presidency and the like. And these will be things like Ray Langton's Speech Act analysis of pornography, Jason Stanley on fascism and all of that sort of thing. And one thing that you say in the book, which is, again, really quite provocative, I think, not just to people invested in the idea of doing something like analytic philosophy, is that something about the flexibility of the idea of analytic philosophy, whatever that is today, is able to take topics like, say, social inequality that, would have been, you'd have gone to the Marxists for that before, or, the ills or otherwise of pornography that you would have gone to the feminist theories for before. And, I think the word you use is colonizes them in some way. That kind of like sweeps into these areas and seems to offer some kind of way of approaching these things, but perhaps I get the sense without some of the real critical bite that those things could have otherwise. So I guess what's going on there and now?
Yeah, what is going on exactly is a really interesting question. And I think to go back to sort of what some of the pressures are that create this sort of increased attention to social issues and to the concerns of feminists and of critical race theorists. Part of it is just that it's going on everywhere in the university around analytic philosophers. And analytic philosophers are not so insulated that they don't notice this. And of course, it's happening in the wider society. So they're not these atomized individuals that speak from a value-neutral point of nowhere. No, they're not complete, windowless monads. There's there's something coming in, and so there's bound to be some attempt to make sense of all of that and to sort of turn towards it. Somebody has said. American philosophy professor called Kevin Richardson wrote a blog post in which he said there has been a social turn in analytic philosophy. And I think that sounds kind of wonderful. It would be wonderful if it were true. If there was a social turn in the sense in which people used to talk about the linguistic turn, which was this kind of supposed to be this fundamental methodological shift in how people did philosophy, doing it all through the lens of language. But I don't think there's been anything like a social turn in the sense of now, finally, analytic philosophy is getting on board with the idea of sort of seeing the world through the social, which would bring it, curiously close to some of its traditional opponents. But there's been this increased interest in these topics, and then it's very interesting to see how what then happens is the subjection of those topics and those interests, and often the movements that are associated with them, to the kind of imperatives of analytic philosophy. And I use this word colonization advisedly because I think, one of the key features of, and a word that we haven't used yet, I think, is capitalism. But, empiricism, liberalism, which I think is effectively one thing, is the ideology of a historical movement, which is the takeover of the world by capital. and that comes from a particular place, right? It comes from Europe, and it's engendered in a particular intellectual environment, which is precisely the intellectual environment that analytic philosophy connects itself with, namely the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment. And what you get, so you get different things in different cases, but the case of analytic feminism, I think, is one of the most curious ones, because here you get a transformation in what it can mean to be a feminist philosopher in the English-speaking world, which happens in the early 1990s, and it's very specifically datable when it happens. So before the early 1990s, there were people who were on the inside of analytic philosophy departments who were interested in feminism. And what they tended to have to do was they had to sort of lean out the window and communicate with actual feminists out there who were not in the analytic philosophy departments, because the issues that feminists were interested in were things that were completely beyond the pale in analytic philosophy departments. And when I say beyond the pale, they were even they were ridiculed in quite extreme ways. So feminists sort of had to go elsewhere. But then in the early 90s, you start to get a kind of in-house feminism, and it comes to be called analytic feminism. And part of what motivates it is actually, I think, really interesting, and it's a thing that would take a lot more time to discuss, but it's a certain kind of grappling with questions about objectivity and the nature of reason, which are internal to the kind of theoretical tradition of second-wave feminism. And analytic philosophers, or people sort of raised on analytic philosophy, have a particular sort of sensitivity to the idea, well, we don't want to, we don't want to get into some kind of question. We don't want to have the wrong conception of what it might be for reason to be masculinized or feminized. And this is something that's driving them. But where they end up is a conception of what the issues in feminism are that get confined by kind of what seems possible from the point of view of philosophers who are mostly interested in questions of language, which is what these people are trained in. And so they're drawn to a particular body of work, and it's the work of actually a self-described Marxist feminist, Catherine MacKinnon in the United States. And the reason why Catherine MacKinnon, why her work, which is so unlike analytic philosophy, because if you've read anything by MacKinnon, it's extremely rhetorical and sort of rouses the emotions. The thing that makes MacKinnon's work sort of amenable for analyticization is that MacKinnon is a lawyer who's working within the confines of how U.S. law treats the dissemination of pornography, namely in terms of rights of speech, because the regulation of pornography had been done in terms of the speech rights of pornographers, right, to distribute this material. And MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin do this very interesting thing of turning all of this on its head and saying, well, what about the speech rights of women as people who have to live in societies in which this stuff was produced, and it's affecting them constantly. But because of this peculiarity about the US law, you get this emphasis on speech acts. And so as this develops, as I try to show, you get this a curious sort of hollowing out of some of what second-wave feminists like MacKinnon and Dworkin are trying to do, because of the reduction of the issues to being questions of language and thought, as opposed to material life. Right? Then I think in the case of critical race theory, you get something rather different, but again, it happens in the early 90s, which is that a whole debate is set based on, again, the work of one person, and that's Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is somebody who's very concerned to promote the idea that race doesn't exist. And Appiah has his very particular arguments for it. But what happens when analytic philosophy then becomes interested in questions about race is that it takes this as the sort of matrix for thinking about race at all. And this again answers to a certain kind of set of intellectual habits. Like, what is X? So there's a whole kind of particular literature that develops that again becomes very detached from any actual social movements. So yeah, I mean, those are just sort of two examples of ways in which there is a kind of hollowing out, and I think that hollowing out is aptly described as a kind of colonization, and I want to emphasize how it's akin to something colonial because of the tendency that liberalism has to see itself as no ideology at all. Right? It's just what everyone thinks anyway. You know, let's treat everyone the same. Let's let everyone go about their merry lives, pursuing their own projects, and let's not whoever we are exactly, right? There's always this kind of ambiguous we that's wielded. Let's not get in the way of these other people. And one of the functions of this is to defang the very statements that some of the people that are being talked to are trying desperately to make, and that cannot be heard precisely because of the kind of silencing effect that this. But we were always already taking everyone into account, right? Everyone's free to come and go as they please in the marketplace of ideas, say their thing, and then please, exit quietly. Again, don't cause any fuss. But all of this is already accounted for. Well, maybe not, right? Maybe if feminism or feminist philosophy starts to take the form of a certain kind of discussion in a philosophy seminar room in which nobody ever gets to feel ill at ease. I mean, that's a really uncanny phenomenon, right? And there's obviously a question about whether analytic philosophers, as the people that they are, can progress beyond that or break out of that. And I think my suggestion is that, well, maybe they could, but it wouldn't be analytic philosophy anymore. Right? So I think in the area of the philosophy of race, you see something quite interesting, which is that people who do say quite radical things and pursue quite radical projects find themselves effectively straddling the accepted part of the academy, the analytic part, and something that's actually on the outside. And it can be difficult for them to manage that. But sometimes the social reality and what's being said outside of those seminar rooms is so compelling that it's pulling people sort of in different directions. But the analytic part has this sort of tendency to bring everything back to questions of mere conceptual analysis in a way that seems to me quite undermining of those programs themselves.
Well, it's interesting because I guess this kind of brings us back pretty much full circle to the questions about why it is we need something like a social history of analytic philosophy, right? You have these alternative ways of seeing the world which insist in some important way on, for want of a better word, positionality, right? That it is something that it is like to be a woman, to be working class, to be black, whatever. And that the point of view from nowhere is not really the best way that we can possibly get at these things. So there's always going to be this tension between a fundamental, no, let's pull it back to this particular form of experience, which perhaps relies not on a detached observer that's simply looking out at the world, but is somebody who's always already kind of involved in it in a really important way. I mean, I've got a few more questions about that, but I'm also conscious that we might want to get some questions from the audience and stuff. Yes, we definitely should do that. So I guess I'll open it up. Should I give that? Nice one.